Hi, I'm Chris Lee, and this is Virtually Speaking. Joining me today is Dr. Pippa Malmgren, an international multiple best-selling author who's an expert on the economy, leadership, and technology, a two-time World Economic Forum global leader for tomorrow, who's an internationally regarded financial authority and trend spotter, a former advisor to U.S. presidents and the British Prime Minister and the National Economic Council. And she's one of a few experts who accurately predicted the 2007 and 8 real estate bubble, BREXIT, and Donald Trump's victory in the 2016 election. Pippa's bestsellers are Signals, The Leadership Lab, Geopolitics for Investors, and in 2020, she released her timely and critically acclaimed book, The Infinite Leader. In 2019, Computer Weekly named her one of the most influential women in tech in the UK, and she was named as one of the top 100 women in tech by We Are Tech. She and Walter Isaacson together won the 2015 Intelligence Squared debate on robotics, and Forbes has called her a must-follow on Twitter. In 2018, she was listed as one of the most influential economists in the world, one of the most influential in geopolitics, and one of the top 100 women in blockchain, and one of the 5th most powerful women in finance. So please join me now with the incredible Dr. Pippa Malmgren. Well, hello, Pippa Malmgren. How are you doing? Thank you for joining me on Virtually Speaking. What's going on?
Thank you for having me. I'm so psyched about this.
Me too. And you're my first international guest. You're actually sitting in London, England right now.
I am. I'm American, but I've lived in London for a long time. Spent my career all over the world.
Yeah, and you grew up in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, my dad worked for 4 presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, and it kind of turned into a family business. I ended up working for a couple of presidents, British Prime Minister, heads of government around the world.
Yeah. Absolutely. And what did you do for these people that you worked for? You were an advisor on the economy, is that correct?
Yeah, my thing is trying to help people see what's coming on the horizon, whether they're in the world of politics or they're running businesses. It's about anticipating what the world economy is going to bring. And I find it possible to figure that out before it arrives. Most people find this really hard, but I don't know, somehow I was able to see the financial crisis coming. I saw Trump being elected, and predictions and preferences, not the same thing, but just to say, and lots of things that I think business people call me in and political people to help them understand how to horizon scan, how to see what's coming, because they're so busy doing their day-to-day detail, they just don't get a chance to look up. And my job is to help them see what's there and to comprehend it so they can get ready for it.
Right. And so what was your title under George W. Bush?
I was on the National Economic Council, special assistant to the president. And 2 big things I worked on then was we had 7 of the 9 largest bankruptcies in American history in my first year there. That was Enron, Tyco, WorldCom. So I worked on Sarbanes-Oxley and all that stuff. And then the second big event, of course, was 9/11. And I was the only person on the National Economic Council with a bit of background in national security. So they put me in charge of the issue of terrorism risk to the economy after 9/11. So an amazing period in my life.
Yeah, that's an amazing time to be advising, analyzing, thinking about, protecting, and you really had a lot of background from what your own dad did and your own parents did, but also, from your whole career of really being an economist, but working with governments on their economies, and also being a technology influencer. You had your own robotics company, I know, that you exited from. The Computer Weekly in 2019 named you one of the most influential women in tech in the UK, one of the 50 top inspiring women in the UK as well. That was in tech also, I think, or top 100 in tech by We Are Tech. So technology and the economy and politics, it's kind of a mishmash, but you make sense of it. How do you do that?
Well, that's the thing. They're all intertwined, and you can't really pull them apart. You have to have a comprehensive view. So I'll give you an example. geopolitics used to be about aircraft carriers and tanks, right? We would talk about war games, and that's what we meant. Now, geopolitics and war games are about actual children's games like TikTok and Fortnite and Minecraft. And you're like, how do we go from aircraft carriers to computer games? And it's because of data. And the new battle zone that the superpowers are fighting over is who has the greatest command of data. And that's why all these governments in the US, Russia, China, they're spending a fortune, record spending on computational power, supercomputers. Now, that's really important because I think the spinoffs from that are going to be as big or bigger than the spinoffs from NASA in the 1960s and 70s. And the private sector ought to be ready and waiting for these extraordinary benefits that are going to come from this incredible spending on how to compute a huge amount of data. Because whoever has the best capacity for that can break the code for anything, whether that's the genetic code, that's a nuclear code, or it's frankly a Bitcoin password code.
Wow, that's crazy. And you're going to talk today about your latest book that just came out, which is The Infinite Leader, which has a very compelling title. And that just came out this week, right? Or last week?
Yeah, October the 3rd. Yeah. In fact,
Amazing.
The US launch is in about a week and a half. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it's perfect. This is perfect timing. And you're also going to talk about the kind of, which is so fun to be able to talk to you about the future, but the future of our society that we live in. I mean, I know in London, there's a parallel there with the government kind of electing a guy like Trump, let's just say, and Brexit and all of that. You see what's going on there because you lived there for many years, but also you know very well what's going on here. So I know we talked just a little bit before we started this about the future, and you seem to think that 2021 is, as I tend to think and hope, and I'm a very optimistic person, but you tend to think it's going to be a very positive outlook. You have a very positive outlook and a very positive time for us. I mean, really, isn't it just, anything is going to be better than this? I mean, anything's up from where we are now anyway, or is it really some things are happening that you're really excited about?
Well, I think both. So I'll say this, COVID is very interesting because it reveals the underlying pre-existing conditions, initially in a person, but over time in businesses, in economies, and in societies. So it reveals when the debt problem is too great. It reveals when a business doesn't have the right cash flow or the right business model. It's revealing the social stresses, for example, in American society about the African-American population and their feeling that they don't have the position that they really ought to have by this day and age. And I know I speak to audiences all over America, and I look and I'm like, where are the people of color? Where's everybody I went to college with? And this is important that the US is now addressing this. And I know it's a super controversial issue and people are on all sides on how to address it, but actually, I think it's a good thing it's being addressed. Anyway, COVID it's bringing up all these things that were already there. Then add to that it's unleashing a wave of entrepreneurial energy, because as so many businesses collapse and disappear, business models die, the fact is, it's a question of faith. Do you believe that people just go home and roll over and become a ward of the state? Or do you think they go, okay, I got to do something. Let's do something. Let's build a business. Let's find a friend who's building a business. Let's be imaginative. And I take the latter view of life. So what I see is we are going to have a wave of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial startups. And that's always a very good thing, because entrepreneurial firms generate 2/3 of the net new jobs in the US economy. So this is crucial. And it's happening at a time when we have a record amount of money being injected into the world economy by governments. This is not to be underestimated. This is way bigger than the financial crisis. So if you add up that we've got record cash looking for a home and record number of entrepreneurs who are trying to scramble to come up with something new that really works, that alone already, they're going to find each other at some point. But I'll add some more stuff. we've also had this extraordinary leap in digitization. Now, what does that mean? What it means is, the way I'm presenting to you right now, it's not my atoms of reality. It's actually little packets of electronic data, right? I'm converted from atoms of reality into packets of information, electric bits of information. Well, this is happening across the board. So, Zoom is the most famous example of this, but it's so much bigger than that. So, for example, I worked in the world of drones. Most people think drones are about, what are they going to deliver to me? Are they going to bring a book to my house or a beer to me on the golf course? But that's not what it's really about. It's really about teleporting your perception to far distant places. It's about taking your sensory perception and placing it on the other side of the state, the other side of the country, the other side of the world. And now you can look at an agribusiness in Brazil or a mining site in Africa with more precision and clarity than if you were standing there yourself with your own eyes. Now, that digitization is revolutionizing how value can be captured. So if now I add those three things together, this is an incredible foundation for growth, incredible. And I think we're going to find 5 years from now that the recovery happens so quickly that a lot of people weren't able to keep up. But what they're preparing for right now is the Great Depression Mark II. So let me finish by saying something about the actual Great Depression in the 1920s, which is maybe the last period in history that's parallel to what we're experiencing now. That in the 1920s, we got two different things at once. And this is important because everybody says, what's the shape of the recovery? It is a V shape. Is it an L shape? The answer is it's not linear, it's quantum. So what I mean by that is, like in the 1920s, when we were recovering from World War I and the Spanish flu, which, by the way, was so much worse than this. I mean, you could be perfectly fine at 10 a.m. and dead by 10 p.m., right? Completely different level of virulence. People were so happy to survive those two huge things that they just went nuts spending. And that is the novel The Great Gatsby, right? Where they just bought champagne and lived the high life because they were just so happy to be alive at all. But at the same time, in the 1920s, 60% of the American public were at the poverty line. And they formed a foundation for another novel, The Grapes of Wrath. And it took a couple generations for those people, the Okies, to kind of get back on to the world economy and find their foothold again. So could we have both? My answer is that's what we're going to have. We're going to have both. So don't ask the question, is the recovery A or B? The recovery is probably everything all at once. My point is, you shouldn't miss the Great Gatsby end of that spectrum, because we are so fueled for that to happen. And I believe it'll happen first and fastest in the United States.
Well, that's good news.
Yeah.
So who's going to win the election? No, I'm just kidding. You said that you knew that Trump, or you felt that Trump was going to win. Is that because you were in the UK and you were seeing what was going on there, or is it because you could just tell that America was hungry for change and there were a lot of people struggling in poverty without a voice, and they felt like there was a reason to vote for him? Again, this is not my opinion. This is just me, analyzing it along with a lot of other people like you. But is that why you knew he was going to win?
So I wrote a book in 2016 called Signals. And it was all about how, when we think about the economy, we tend to look at data. And by definition, that means you're looking backward. But we know that what happened in the past usually doesn't extrapolate in a neat line into the future. Unfortunately, right. It's not that easy. So my concept was, there are all sorts of signals that tell you about what's coming, but they're not yet in the data. So some of the signals I saw was that the debt problem everywhere in the world was, it's like a weight that bears down on the social fabric, and it breaks the promises that hold the society together. Like, for example, the promise that you could retire at 65. But in fact, because of the debt burden, then the government goes, well, actually, the new retirement age is not 65, it's like 93, right? You all know you're going to have to retire like so much later than you expected. That's a break of a promise. Now, if you break enough of those promises, you rip apart the social fabric, you're going to get a lot of things. You're going to get social protest. You're going to get nationalism. You're going to get people who start to be very inward oriented. And all of those things led me to believe that we would end up with that in many places, not just the US, but China, the UK. And so that resurgence of nationalism, social protest is a function of this concept of signals that I raised. And I think it's still in motion.
Is it still? Yeah.
People still feel they have to repair the social fabric. They're coming up with a new social contract about what's the right relationship between governments and citizens, between companies and customers, among citizens. This is all up for grabs. And while that's unsettling, it's also a super exciting time in history, because I'm sure we'll reach a conclusion.
Well, yeah, I like to talk to people about the fact that in my own experience and the experiences of many other people who I've been talking to throughout this period since March or so, is that we're having to look at ourselves in the mirror. Like you said, it reveals all of the things that weren't working. And we have to now look at ourselves in the mirror and say, ooh, what could I be doing better than that I wasn't doing before? What is it that I can do now that I never got around to doing that now I need to do because my business is depending on it. My business needs this. Ways to streamline, ways to be more productive, ways to be, more positive, more healthy. All these things we're focusing on because of COVID, because our businesses are suffering and people around us are suffering and we don't want to suffer and we want to pull ourselves out. We've got to improve on a lot of stuff. So I think a lot of the things we learn and start doing differently during COVID are going to boost us into much more success. And we might actually turn around 5-10 years from now and go, that was the turning point in my life because I actually changed some things and my business got better and my health got better. So hopefully that's how most people are going to take a look at this time and react to it.
Totally. And in fact, that was exactly the idea behind this most recent book, the Infinite Leader. That was precisely the thought process my co-author and I put into it. We didn't anticipate the pandemic, but we were definitely seeing that people were so overwhelmed that they weren't conducting their leadership very well. And let's face it, we've had a crisis of leadership in every category: business, religious communities, politics. I mean, there isn't a category where we haven't seen catastrophic failure. And in the last 2 years, the single most common reason that CEOs are forced out are ethical lapses. So you're like, what is that about? And we realized that there are sort of two levels of it. One is how to manage organizations. And that was the focus of the book, The Leadership Lab, which came out in 2018, which I wrote with Chris Lewis, who's the author of Too Fast to Think as well. But this new book, we realized that actually it's a very personal thing. And your personal dialogue with yourself is where it begins. And leadership isn't always the president or that person over there or someone else. It's actually every one of us. And we all have the power to make decisions and see the world in new ways if we choose to do so. And so this new book is very much about how to learn the skill of reframing, reforming, seeing reality in a completely new and different way. We took the idea that, whenever you say to yourself, it's zero. We got zero money, there's zero possibility, any kind of zero feeling that you ever have. Well, a zero is a circle, and a circle is a very ancient symbol of wholeness. A lot of brands are always in the shape of a circle. And if you just change your perspective, you twist it a bit, you can actually turn it into an infinity symbol. And this process of moving from a seeming nothing to work with to infinite possibility is our job. And that's what we need to do. And that's what people have learned from COVID. One of the gifts that COVID brought was you could say, you know what, we're going to take everything away. You're not going to be able to go to work. You're not going to be able to live the life you did. It's like everything you were doing is gone. And people have reconstructed and reformed and reshaped and come up with new ways that actually they're going, why was I killing myself before? I'm able to do things so much smarter now. I have a better sense of my actual priorities. And I think this ability to perceive in new ways has been enhanced. So I'll finish just with one idea, which is I like the idea very much. And I'm always trying to help my audiences understand this concept that was introduced by Ezra Pound, the poet in the 1930s. and Marshall McLuhan, who was writing in the 1960s. Both of them said artists are the radar of society.
Yeah.
Now, most people in business have no time for art, right? Like for them, art is like, well, I'll go to a gallery like once a year. No, art is a community of people who see stuff coming before everybody else. And so if you watch them, they'll tell you what's on the way. So for example, I know it sounds crazy as an economist, but the Paris fashion shows of December 2018, I was watching, right? I'm interested in fashion. You know, I'm a woman. That's an artistic space that interests me. What did they show? They showed riot gear. I'm like, you know what? I think they might be onto something, because I understood the context of social protest, the things that might instigate it. And then the fashion designers start showing riot gear on the runway. I'm like, I think we need to pay attention to this.
It wasn't just like one outfit, it was multiple?
No, multiple. Actually, you can see it now in this presidential election. Melania Trump, what did she wear to the first debate? Military dress. This kind of sense of militancy is reflected in the choices of you know, what we wear. And so again, now we've got a little time, because COVID has restored our sense of time. We begin to have freedom to choose. What am I going to look at? What art am I going to follow? Mm-hmm. What interesting things are going on that I wasn't looking at before because I was in my own narrow little world? But if you widen up, you can start to absorb a lot of signals, and suddenly the landscape's a lot clearer than it was.
So what's the number one thing that somebody can do who's an entrepreneur or a manager or a CEO? What's the number one thing somebody can do right now to kind of be more aware of the signals?
Well, one is to just get yourself better situational awareness. That's a military term. And I do some lecturing for the British military at Sandhurst, which is kind of the equivalent of West Point. Situational awareness is understanding what's happening around you. Now that sounds so simple, but you know, in working with CEOs and presidents, they often are quite disconnected from what's going on because they're so protected. The higher you go, the more protected you are from reality, the fewer people can randomly get to you. And the people around you, you already know them well, so they're not always bringing new, fresh material.
It's a bubble.
It's a bubble. So you got to open yourself up to new people, new ideas, new sources of information. And a second thing is to understand the task. Most people in leadership positions think the task is like hiking to the top of Mount Everest. You pick a target and then you go get equipped, and then you get a team together and we're going to go to the top of Mount Everest. But what if it's not a static target? I think it's more like surfing. And I think I told you before we started that I grew up surfing the beaches of California because my grandmother was a school teacher in LA. So we spent every summer out there. It's a lot more like surfing. You're dealing with constantly conflicting forces, highly fluid environment. It's sunny one minute and about to storm the next. And your target is to stay afloat. It's to stay on that board. So it's not like hiking to Mount Everest. It's not a fixed target. It's a totally different skill set, and balancing and learning how to balance. And I recommend that people get a balance board. They literally get a balance board at home. If you're over 40, you ought to do that anyway for your physical health. But as you physically experience being on a balance board and how hard that is, you start to open your mind to, wow, what is going on in my business that maybe I haven't been paying attention because I've been so focused on that target, I missed all the other things.
That's interesting. That's great. Okay, so economy, economist, that's your kind of main focus and your main word that people would use to describe you as a speaker. And a lot of people say, I want an economist. I want somebody to talk about the future of the economy. So what is going to happen? What's the future of the economy right now in the United States and the UK? Is it pretty clear to you? Do you have a pretty good idea of is the worst behind us, or is it coming? And what does 2021 look like? Tell us we'll be able to look at this in a year and say, oh, she was right.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there are always opportunities. Even in the most dire circumstances, there are always opportunities. And you can always create something out of nothing. You can. And I think it's important to look at examples of people who are doing that. I'll give you an example I've seen here in Britain. It was super interesting. You know, you would think there's nothing new you could do with pizza, right? I mean, we all know pizza. Well, I saw this British company that was selling pizza kits, and they were selling them to pubs, which really means, you know, the restaurants. So that meant that they could have fresh, but it was sort of halfway made, right? They'd sell you all the stuff, and then you'd quickly put it together, throw it in the oven. Then COVID happened, all the pubs were closed. This business was dead in the water. And the management sat down, and in 10 days, they totally reconfigured the whole business model away from B2B, turned it towards home delivery to the consumer, took on one of the biggest brand names in the world, Domino's Pizza, and aced it, started beating them because the quality was so much higher and the attention to detail. Plus, it coincided with COVID when everybody's stuck at home, and the idea that everybody gets to design their own pizza was suddenly hugely appealing. It's like a family, community, you know, togetherness kind of thing. And also, it's about composing the future, you know, designing it yourself. And this is also part of the zeitgeist. Anyway, they turned that thing around and they are flying. Now, nobody looking at that business model, no venture capital firm, no private equity firm would have said that's possible. They would have said it's a totally different set of skills. It's a completely different market. It has completely different financing requirements, blah, blah, blah. The reality is they did it in 10 days and they did it successfully. I think everybody can do that in every single business. And again, lack of access to capital, which is usually the excuse people use, like why we can't get it done. I would point out that Jeff Bezos at Amazon says his most successful divisions of Amazon are always the ones with the least capital. And that forces them to use the one thing that we've all got, but we often don't use, and that's imagination. And I do think imaginal skills are critical. So when I talk about what's coming in the future, I'm using imaginal skills. I'm using imagination. And I love the quote from Mark Twain where he says, "The eyes cannot see clearly if the imagination is out of focus." That is so true. So what you have to do is begin to imagine a different future. So what I see is entrepreneurs, tech people, policymakers, literally reimagining. And I'll give you some practical examples. Again, I'll use a British example, but I like using them from all over the world. But in this country, to get planning permission to build a new building is a really big process. It's a rigmarole. And they only let you build a building with one purpose. So it's either an office building or it's residential or it's going to be a grocery store. You can't build a building that's a lot of things. Then COVID happens and the government wants construction because this is an employer and they want to build into the future. And so they announced they're abandoning all the planning restrictions. So now I think we're going to start to see what's actually required, which are buildings in urban areas that are going to be grocery store on the ground level, several levels of office space, several levels of residential, and then some urban farms. Like you're going to see buildings that are multi-purpose and serve many different interests, which now that we've had COVID, everybody's realizing we need more farming in city centers, right? And buildings need to accommodate people who are working and living. So is that going to totally radically transform construction? Yes. And it's happening at a time in history when we have a revolution in construction methods. So we're in, you know, traditionally humanity had to start with a substance like a log, and you would turn it into a piece of furniture or a wall. Now we can start with a need and build the material from the atomic structure up. This is called new materials technology. This is going to completely change what kind of buildings we can have, how quickly they can be constructed, modular technology. So I see an unbelievable revolution coming just in the construction of our buildings. That alone. But I could tell you almost every sector I look at, I see equally radical and hugely encouraging changes that are underway. So I just think once we get past the uncertainty, people are going to just roll their sleeves up and boom, they're going to be working. And rather than trying to predict, will it be a further slowdown or will it pick up? this is kind of a mug's game. Prediction's not really a smart way to spend your time. Preparedness is a great way to spend your time. Get prepared for a whole bunch of different scenarios. And one of them is that it takes off, because I think that's the one that most people are going to get wrong-footed on, and they won't be ready. And then it's going to start flying and you won't be able to catch up.
Wow. That's amazing. And I love that. I love that it's more of a kind of a cultural change. You're not necessarily looking at governments are going to, put all this money into the economy and then the economy is going to crash because, inflation or because of different reasons that, we're not going to be able to pay back our debts and all these different things people are worried about. People thought that the Obama administration was doing silly things with the automotive industry, bailing them out, but they all repaid it, with interest. So, I think every government does what it needs to do. And I think that hopefully, they're doing all the things that they need to do right now. But is there anything, that's kind of like anything, that's happening or that we don't know yet, or that's something that's exciting to you that you just found out, or that anything you want to share with us? Maybe a secret, maybe a insight, or maybe just information that not a lot of people are aware of?
Well, I'll tell you some of the things on my mind. One of them you just touched on, inflation. Most people think there can't be any inflation because we're in such a big slowdown. But I think I'm with, people like Stanley Druckenmiller, and some of the most skilled and gifted traders in the world are starting to say, and Warren Buffett as well, I think we're going to get a little inflation. And that's because when you break the global supply chain at both ends, the supply end and the demand end, the US end and the China end, a whole bunch of things start to happen. And one of them is the relocation of production to local environments. I've had to make up a name for this, which is glocalization, right? We used to have globalization, which meant really all the jobs went to China. Glocalization is now all the jobs are going everywhere. We're going to see a resurgence of manufacturing services locally. That's because, again, people want a supply chain that's closer. They want to work with somebody they can see their eyes. They can talk to them on the phone. You can make changes and get results quickly. That's going to be a lot of competition. However, it will also raise prices, I believe, initially. So the thing is, when prices start rising, when we get a little inflation, what does everybody do? They buy equities, because bonds don't work. Equities work. And at the beginning of inflation, asset prices rise, stock markets go up. And like I said before, we've had this extraordinary collapse of a digitization trend that should have taken 10 years, got pushed into 3 months. So the stock market's already telling us that those efficiency gains are being built in. That's why stock markets are so high. So I think the combination of a little inflation, not outrageous inflation, but a little inflation with all these other elements, that tells me the engine's going to start revving. And again, we already know governments are not going to let a terrible slowdown happen. They'll do everything possible to avert it. So you can bank on that. So I guess for those who are pessimists, my question to them is, okay, did you miss the recovery from the dot-com bubble bursting? Did you miss the recovery from the financial crisis? Because if you did, you might feel the same now, like, oh, it's so devastating, we'll never recover. I would say buckle your seatbelt and get ready, because I think we're going to have a recovery from this that beats those previous ones.
Yeah, it seems like it, because once this is kind of resolved, we can kind of get back to where we were, which was a really amazing economy and a lot of good things happening. But of course, the great thing about this is that now we're looking at all the problems we have, and we're going to hopefully fix and address a lot of those social problems, economic problems, irresponsibility of people and businesses, and everything that we kind of need to fix in order. So I feel like it's a little bit of a blessing in disguise. I know you feel the same way. So that's pretty cool. It's almost like there's going to be people who watch this and go, well, these people are crazy. Like, this is a horrible time. And, it's like, which way do you want to look at it?
And also, I think about another way is kind of all the bad news has been built in. Like, there isn't that much more bad news that could really undermine things. Any good news is like, oh, okay, that's amazing.
Right.
One piece of good news goes a long way in this kind of situation. Um, but I don't think I'm being like a Pollyanna. It's a belief that, you know, people are fundamentally going to figure out a way forward, partly because they know they can't depend on government to you know, help them, right? Look at, for example, the fastest growing part of the labor force in the US are people over the age of 50. Now, why is that? That's because they're all going, medical advances means I'm going to live till I'm 90, but I haven't got enough savings to make it that far. And plus, why is it we take the people with the most knowledge and skill and experience and then we sideline them? No, we should have them operating in the economy. And it's not like the old days where you had to have a full-time job with a big blue chip firm. People don't have a portfolio life where they spend part of their time working with a friend who's an entrepreneur, part of a time consulting to some big blue chip company, spread their risk around, and now they're engaged, but still have some control over their time. And I think people get really creative in that space. And I'm seeing a lot of innovation around these people who are older with these skill sets being reintegrated into the economy. And at the other end of the spectrum, a very interesting trend, which is companies are no longer always hiring college graduates. They are starting to hire high school graduates. And what they're looking for in high school graduates is drive and inquisitiveness, not credentials. Because credentials, let's face it, we've kind of gotten over credentialized, right? It reached the point where, you know, unless you had a PhD from Stanford, that you wouldn't qualify. Well, think of all the latent talent that's out there that we could be using to do crazy, interesting things. So I've talked to manufacturers in the US, for example, in the automotive industry, and they've said, we're going back to a 1950s model where we hire somebody who's 18. We're going to pay for their college education, but they'll be working part-time. They'll be working for us mainly and doing college on the side. That's part of a bigger trend of lifelong learning anyway. And then if they want to go to graduate school, we'll support them. But this way we get to train them the way we need them. And the person gets, you know, a good salary and a great experience. And in fact, you know, I talked to the CEO of one automotive company that's hiring this way, and she said to me, you know what our biggest obstacle is? The teachers and the parents. I was like, what? They said, yeah, the teachers and parents say to the kids, you don't want a job in the automotive industry and manufacturing, because they have some Victorian image in their mind of some dirty factory that's, you know, like child labor. So that what they do is they get a bus and they bring all of these people into the factory. And of course, modern manufacturing is pristine and elegant. And, you know, these are really high-tech spaces. Once they see that, then the parents go, oh, actually, this might be good. Anyway, I think there's a return to that. And we're going to see very different hiring patterns. And people are going to get much more practical about what they need, and having a college degree doesn't guarantee that you're the best person for a company to hire. Being inquisitive and energetic are much more important drivers.
Amazing. Wow, that's really, I've heard that from several people, and that's really positive stuff and great to hear. And I hope that obviously happens. So my last question for you, I know we're kind of getting to the end here, and I want to make sure I ask you this question, because why wouldn't I ask you this question? If Biden wins, if Trump wins, either way, two-part question. Are things going to change that much in the US if one or the other wins, number one? And number two, is there anything that is kind of a follow-up to question one? Is there anything that is really concerning that one of these, you know, administrations might do to mess things up or change things or make things worse or not do the right thing? Or is there anything that to look out for?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give you some really controversial, unconventional answers on this.
Yay!
One of them is on one level, we already know the outcome. Whoever wins, the other half of the country is going to hate it. One half of the country is going to be happy with it. So at least what we'll have is certainty. And I think that the markets are going to go up on either one winning just because we have certainty.
Yeah.
There is the view the Democrats will bring in higher taxes, more regulation, more red tape. Probably so. However, I think they're going to have a big argument for about 2 years because internally there's such a spread between the far left and the center of the Democrat Party. What are they actually going to implement? It's not yet clear where the mandate is. And therefore, we may end up with government that doesn't really do very much. And of course, markets love that. They have certainty who's in charge and they can't do anything. Markets go up on that, right? So another thing is, I think there is a very high risk that we aren't going to have certainty, that we won't know who is the president. And now it can happen for multiple reasons. There's the risk that President Trump refuses to go, for example, and we already have senior people in the military talking about how they're not going to get involved in such a scenario, and they wouldn't be saying that. The denials tell you everything that may be a possibility. But now we also have all these people in Washington are down with COVID. And let's face it, we've got the two most elderly presidential candidates we've ever had. Is it possible that Biden wins, but he's in the hospital with COVID? Yeah, this is possible. So suddenly the possibility that we won't know is very real. But what I think is more important than all of that is a little story I heard from a taxi driver that I had in the States. I was in Texas, and he was from Ethiopia, and he was a 25-year-old immigrant. And we were chatting in the taxi about elections. And I was asking him the same question, what do you think? Who do you think is going to win? And he looked in the rearview mirror and he said to me, it doesn't matter to me who wins. I'm going to be a success anyway. And I'm like, you're American, right? That's the whole American, like you're done, you've gotten it. I think Americans are going to say, I got to be a success either way. So what we're seeing is leadership is now moving from the level of the president down, and people are taking leadership responsibility at lower, more granular levels of society. And that's why I think it's really important to watch who's exercising leadership at the city level, at the neighborhood level, at the regional level, because that's where we're going to see a lot of action and change. And that may be more materially important than what happens in the White House.
Amen. Wow. Well, this has been unbelievably exciting and eye-opening.
Covered a lot of material.
Yeah, we covered a lot of different things, and you are a wealth of knowledge and expertise. And I know whenever I pitch you to people and tell people about you, they're always like, wow, she's amazing. So I'm excited that we got to really dive deep into so many cool things, including your new book, some of your other books, and the current status of the world and what's coming. So that was awesome. Thank you so much, Pippa. You are so great to always talk to. It's always very entertaining. I remember the first phone call we had where you went into the drones conversation with me for a long time about that whole world. And that was, I mean, I hung up the phone and I was like, oh my God, that was like, everything with you is so amazing. You know so much, and you know about so many different industries and facets of our economies and our government. So wealth of knowledge.
Thank you so much for having me. This is an amazing opportunity as a speaker to get to, talk about all these different things, because people are like, well, what is it you talk about? And it's like, well, what's coming on the landscape.
Right.
But it doesn't fit into a neat little box all the time. So I really, really appreciate this ability to skate around and really explore.
But I think we boxed it in, as well as we could, and in a way that I think people come away from this knowing you really, really well about what you have to offer, and it's amazing stuff. So again, thank you, Pippa. You are amazing.
Thank you.
I appreciate you. I know it's late in London. It's nighttime. It's dark. It's bedtime, and you're awesome for doing this. So thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Take care. See you later.